This is one in a series of webinars that Vitru, the producers of MasterSpec, and Sustainable Minds, the producer of the Transparency Catalog, are hosting together. The series is called Transparency is the New Green, and we're talking about how to incorporate product and materials transparency in product selection and specification to really make it easier for architects, engineers, contractors, owners, etc., to find transparency information when they're constructing high performance projects. And just to give you a brief overview of what we're going to be doing today, we are going to be talking about the Sustainable Minds 2017 Product Transparency Trend Report, and Terry Swack of Sustainable Minds is going to do that. Terry has been involved for several years in product transparency, starting with Sustainable Minds, which started out doing product transparency software, and most recently produces the Transparency Catalog, which is an online database of products and materials that have transparency information. Terry's going to talk about the Product Transparency Trend Report and basically show what she's seen on her end with respect to product transparency and how it's influencing or being used in the market. Then we're going to have a brief update from Wendy Vittori of the Health Product Declaration Collaborative. She is the executive director of this not-for-profit member organization focused on advancing transparency about products used in the building industry. She's been serving in this role since 2015. Prior to that, she was the principal of Vittori Consulting, a strategy consulting firm, and had a 30-year career as an engineer and senior executive in the computing industry. She's currently a faculty associate at Arizona State University Nonprofit Management Institute and is a graduate of Harvard, where she completed doctoral studies at the Harvard Business School. So she'll bring a pretty interesting perspective to it as she talks about the Health Product Declaration and what the work that the HPDC is doing and how that flows into what Terry's going to talk about in the Product Transparency Trend Report.
Thank you, Michael. Glad to be here.
And just to give you a little bit of an introduction of how Vitru is involved in this, because we're really not going to be talking too much today about MasterSpec or any of the products that are based off of MasterSpec. We are the exclusive publisher of AIA MasterSpec, which is the most used specification system within the US. You may have known us formerly as ARCOM. We rebranded at Greenbuild 2017 to Vitru. Just to kind of give everyone a good idea that we're headed in a new and different direction. We're offering several more products than just what we were doing in the past when we were essentially just publishing MasterSpec. We're about a 60-person firm that's growing fairly rapidly at this point. MasterSpec itself, which is our most popular specification product, is about a 900 plus, I believe it's 917 specification sections as of the first quarter of 2018, with about 6,000 plus products that are generally the most used products by architects and engineers when they're building or designing buildings within the US. Roughly 80% of the ENR top 100 use MasterSpec. I think it's actually in the very high 70s when you take a look at the top 100. And as part of the rebranding, we have a new ethos or mission, and that's really we're committed to constructing a world where better building leads to better lives. And we're looking at many different ways to do that. And one of those is working with Terry and other organizations to really try and find a way to bring interesting content or interesting products into MasterSpec.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Wendy. Super excited to have you here. And obviously very excited to be sharing the content from our 2017 trend report that actually spans 5 years of the story of product transparency, kind of from inception to where things are now. For those of you who are not familiar with Sustainable Minds, we're a B2B cloud provider of environmental product transparency applications, data, and services. I am the CEO and founder and started the company 10 years ago. We are a mission-based company, and our mission has never changed. Our mission is to operationalize environmental performance into mainstream product development and manufacturing to drive revenue and growth through greener product innovation. And our very first product we introduced in 2009 was the very first LCA tool for product development teams to be able to integrate lifecycle thinking and life cycle modeling into early stage product development to understand where impacts were occurring and where improvements could be made to bring actually greener products to market. And in 2012, when product transparency was introduced as part of LEAD version 4, clearly the thinking about how to use life cycle assessment and LCA in design now was being brought to marketing, and clearly using scientific methods to understand those impacts and improve products is a compelling story to tell in the marketplace. So it was a natural next stage for us to develop our transparency products. We really could not be happier about partnering with Vittori and with Michael. At this point in the evolution of product transparency, because what you'll see in this trend report is that in the first 5 years, it's gone from 0 to something pretty big. And now we're looking to take the whole idea set of making higher performing products out of the arena of just people who care about green or who have cared about green, but making that thinking and those products and those brands all available to a much broader audience. And the way to do that is through partnering with companies who make products that are used by a broader, more mainstream audience. So together, what we've kind of planned is we're going to make it easier to get the specifications for products with transparency information. We're going to make it easier for people to learn more about the products themselves that manufacturers are making that are higher performing, greener and healthier. And we're going to make it easier to specify those products through a range of access points and tools, but most importantly through MasterSpec, which is used by the preponderance of the top 100 architecture firms in North America. And we believe that making this information available through a mainstream tool like MasterSpec will absolutely influence decisions that get made and influence construction spend. And so that's our plan together. We're going to deliver a lot of education and bring in other folks from other organizations like Wendy today to bring an additive component to this story to see how people are kind of all moving in the same direction and layering on knowledge and content and opportunity. So here's the table of contents for the trend report. It will be available next week online through the catalog, and the HPDC and Vittori sites will link to it. Everyone who has registered for the webinar will automatically get it sent to them, so don't worry about that. What I'm going to do today is focus really on our findings and the way that we are framing the state of product transparency story. In next month's webinar with Vittori, and we do 2 at the end of every month, one for AECs and one for manufacturers. We're going to dive into more detailed information about the environmental reporting section of the report and the material ingredient reporting section of the report. So today we're really going to focus on kind of the big story, and we'll just give a couple of high points from the other 2 sections, but stay tuned for drilling down into more detail on that as the months go by. So I'm going to start with the overview. Like any technical report, it starts out with the definitions and the methodology that we've used to collect the data, and then I'm going to give you the punchline. What are the big trend results? So definitions. This is how we collect the product transparency reporting data to build and maintain the transparency catalog, keeping in mind that the goal of the catalog is to acknowledge and reward manufacturers for investing in product transparency. The catalog includes all the brands and all their products with disclosures that are eligible to earn the transparency credits and criteria in the green building rating systems. To reward manufacturers and those building professionals specifying those products, to reward them for conducting two types of technical studies and disclosing the findings. The first type is environmental performance. There's only one technical standard that's being used to deliver that environmental performance data. It's ISO 14025. And in the ISO 14025 standard, it outlines the requirements for creating two kinds of technical rule sets. One is called a product category rule, and that's the rule set for how life cycle assessment must be done for a particular type of product group or product category. And then it also contains the rules for the content that will go into the report called a Type 3 Environmental Declaration. That is the actual technical term, Type 3 Environmental Declaration. Colloquially, they are referred to as EPDs, Environmental Product Declarations. That is a slang term. The actual technical term is Type 3 Environmental Declaration. EPD is only one term that can be used to describe that type of declaration. Now, on the material ingredient side, the purpose for doing that kind of technical study and disclosing the findings is to evaluate potential hazards and risks of materials that get used in these products. And there have been a number of disclosure programs and rating systems that have been identified as eligible. Those results are eligible to earn credits in those rating systems. And we're going to touch on just a little bit before Wendy's section about the breakdown between disclosure programs and rating systems, and they're different. But all of the products listed in the catalog meet the eligibility requirements for one or both types of credits in one or more of the green building rating systems. So the reporting period for the data collection was all of 2017, and it included all existing EPDs and material disclosures in that time frame, plus any new ones that were published. Here's the list of green building rating systems that offer credits for each type of disclosure. And below that is all of the sources where we collected published data from monthly to add those manufacturers to the transparency catalog. Here's the punchline. Without a drum roll, it turns out that there are 1,225 EPDs that have been published and 8,404 total material disclosures from across all of the programs in many, if not most, of the CSI MasterFormat divisions. So there's two things we wanted to point out. One is that the finishes division is a pretty broad division. There's a lot of sections in that division that includes products that get typically specified on a daily basis into new construction, as well as refurbishing or renovating existing construction. So that's why that category, that division has a lot of activity. The other thing we wanted to point out was that in the furnishings division, a big part of the reason why there are so many material disclosures is that over 3,900 of them are BIFMA level certificates. And BIFMA has done a really great job of getting their members' products certified to be able to earn credits in these green building rating systems. So kudos to BIFMA. Now, with that data in hand, here's the story of the state of product transparency. We're going to talk about the model that we're going to tell that story with, the diffusion of innovations model. What do those results look like visually? What is transparency really about? Changing attitudes, who's asking for it, what don't we know from the data, and growing pains about the things that are going to need to be addressed going forward. So here's the premise, which is that product transparency in the building products industry is a new technology, and that while the science and methods behind the modeling, measuring, and evaluating are well established, product transparency's use in product selection and product marketing is the innovation. So back in 2012, when the USGBC announced LEAD v4 with product transparency as a key concept, product transparency effectively became the new standard of green. The single attribute ratings and certifications that were rewarded in LEAD v3 do tell an important story about attributes of given product categories. But that said, product transparency calls for the use of standardized scientific methods applied in the same way across all product categories to comprehensively measure the life cycle impacts and the hazards and risks potential by the materials used in those products, so that we could start establishing baselines or benchmarks and making comparative assessments, but again, looking comprehensively across the life cycle of a product, more than looking at a single attribute. So when we look at what has happened over the past 5 years, product transparency really illustrates this diffusion of innovations theory, or this theory can be used to illustrate what's happened in the marketplace. And so what the theory says is, explains why new ideas, how they get adopted, the rate at which they get adopted, and why. And that there are 4 main elements that must come together to create this diffusion. It's the innovation itself, communication channels, time, and a social system. And what we're showing on the left is that there does reach a point known as the tipping point, beyond which there's kind of no turning back. And there is only the going forward. And so what we're telling you in this trend report and in this story is that we are arriving at the tipping point. The data shows that, as well as the qualitative data that we've gathered as well. So to apply those aspects of that theory, the social system is the AEC community and the manufacturers who have been called upon to provide this information. The innovation is the product transparency disclosures and the ones that existed and the new ones that have been created. We're looking at a 5-year period, and there have really been many communication channels contributing to the advancement, including the reporting program providers themselves, the program operators and the material ingredient disclosure programs and rating systems, the NGOs, the nonprofits, the industry organizations who represent both building professionals as well as those trade organizations in the product manufacturing sectors, certainly media, and finally the solution providers like Sustainable Minds and UL Environment and Mindful Materials and a handful of others who have shown up to engage in this opportunity to help manufacturers and our own businesses to drive revenue and growth through greener and healthier product innovation. Every single one of these channel partners, I'll call them, have been really important to driving the growth of this new innovation, and it's only going to continue. So that's what we're going to be looking at. Now, it's one thing to give you some numbers, but it's better to visualize that data so we can really take it in. So we launched the Transparency Catalog at Greenbuild in 2016, and we actually pulled the catalog together pretty quickly in just a matter of a couple of months because we determined that there were finally enough manufacturers investing in product transparency to scrape together into a catalog-like thing where we could really just focus on the brands. We wanted to bring attention to all the brands investing in product transparency all in one place so that people could start seeing that there were enough manufacturers who really were doing this, and to enable people to make sure that this keeps going by being able to find and specify their products. At that time, there were 350 brands when we launched the catalog. Within 1 year, by December 31, 2017, the catalog had grown to 961 brands and industry organizations, over 500 of which had done some kind of environmental performance reporting. 405 had only done material reporting, and 93 had done both. Now, what we also did during that time was we added 313 manufacturers and industry associations who had participated in creating industry-wide EPDs. And some of those folks had also created product-specific EPDs, so we didn't double count. But during that time, 298 new manufacturers did produce either a product-specific EPD or a material disclosure or both, which created an 85% increase in the number of brands investing in product transparency in 14 months. So a pretty significant uptick in just 1 year. So now let's talk about what product transparency is really about, because we did talk about the drivers have been the green building rating systems and getting credits, and that's great. You need an incentive to get things going and off the ground. But what product transparency is really all about is performance. And today, the way the industry defines successful buildings, they're defined as high performance buildings. And now that term high performance includes environmental performance and material health. These are performance criteria. Environment and material, they're performance criteria. And so the reason to do life cycle assessment, and originally the intent had always been for understanding where in the life cycle of a product the impacts are occurring. This is internal for manufacturers to be able to evaluate their products and their processes, and then be able to bring new strategies to bear to reduce those impacts, improve those products, and bring higher performing products to market. And it's the same thing for the material ingredient reporting. It's the same purpose. You want to analyze the material ingredients of a product to determine where there might be risks and hazards, to be able to evaluate alternative materials, alternative approaches to performance, a whole range of options to improve the material health of products. And so there's clearly the driver to improve the performance, because then you're going to have a great story to tell when you create those disclosures and use them in product-facing, in customer-facing venues. But the other thing to keep in mind is that where there are impacts, there are costs. And we're going to talk about that in next month's webinar when we drill into environmental reporting. So that in and of itself, knowing that there are real opportunities for not only environmental performance improvement, but cost improvement and innovation is really going to be in a different way for folks to think about the primary purpose of LCA. But why is performance important now? Performance is important now because the impacts from the built environment on the natural environment are dramatically increasing at a very rapid pace. And if buildings are only a sum of their parts, then actual performance matters, and you can't manage what you don't measure. So we believe that product transparency does build credibly greener brands, but not by just producing disclosures. That the value for manufacturers to provide environmental information about their products comes from demonstrating they know what it means and they understand what they're doing. Now, we've seen some pretty interesting changing attitudes from manufacturers who were not early adopters and were not potentially even fast followers, but are now following, who have said, we're diving in, we're going to do more disclosures, we're going to make our disclosures easier to access and find, because we don't know what we don't know. And we've really done probably hundreds of interviews and discussions with people in all different roles in product manufacturing organizations. And, you know, this is kind of where folks are at. We don't know what we don't know. We don't know if we're missing opportunities because they haven't been able to find our products with transparency information. And what's also key is them knowing that if there were more visibility of the products with disclosures that would be easy to find by architects, they also know that it would be easier for salespeople to be more proactive, to bring the attention of these products to the folks that they're selling to as well. So we get asked a lot, well, who's asking for transparency? Who's asking for it? And, you know, the architecture community did a great start early on in 2013 with their letter writing campaign, kind of laying down a deadline of 2015. We're not going to do business with manufacturers who aren't ready. That deadline was very difficult to meet because transparency is challenging. But what it did do is it stimulated many AEC firms to establish policies over the year regarding how they'll select materials for different kinds of projects and what goes into those products. And now many AEC firms, and when I say C, I actually do mean construction firms, who are actually building their business plans around going after green building projects that will be eligible for not only green building rating system credits, but will perform at that same level of performance without necessarily going for the certification, because a lot of the guidance in these programs is getting written into building codes. So again, an opportunity to innovate and grow through greener product innovation. But the thing we want to kind of close this idea with is the one surefire social system reason that product transparency will be moving forward is millennials. And the bottom bullet is an interesting statistic that those of us who are baby boomers will be retired by the middle of the 2020s. And the workforce at that point in time will be comprised of a preponderance of folks who were born in the millennial generation, who were born using devices and always look to data to be able to make decisions, and even go so far as to be suspicious about why isn't there data, why are you not being transparent? You know, there must be something to hide. And so for sure, the demand for product transparency will only increase, and the ability for that data to be used to be able to make decisions is increasingly going to be more critical. Now, here's a very interesting number or set of numbers, because the data can't tell us the number of products that are in the market today that have transparency disclosures. And this is important because people aren't looking for disclosures. They're looking for products with disclosures. So if we were to try to put some numbers to how many products are there in the market with transparency information, we know the total number of manufacturers now, and we know the total number of disclosures that have been created. And we know that a disclosure can represent at least one product, but many, if not most, disclosures represent more, and oftentimes many more. One HPD can represent 10 products, as can an EPD, 50 products, 100 products. Sustainable Minds has even supported a manufacturer creating an HPD that covered 1,200 products. And so we did a little bit of math and tried to do something a little bit comparative too. So we looked at the suites catalog, and this is current numbers, 484 manufacturers in suites with over 300,000 products, and not surprisingly, the top division was finishes. So in the transparency catalog, there are 961 brands representing the numbers that we've already covered. So if we did a really broad range of 1 to 100, there's an estimated roughly 10,000 to 100,000, a million products available with transparency disclosures. And that's not even mentioning how many products get covered by one industry-wide EPD, or the number of concrete mixes covered in a single EPD. And so this insight was something that we had when we started the catalog, which is why the standard presentation of product information in the catalog is shown in this fashion. The manufacturer gets to organize their products by CSI MasterFormat division, and then within each division, they can show the products that they have correlated to each of the disclosures that they have. And oftentimes, a manufacturer has more than just one type of material ingredient disclosure. And this links to their website. These link to the disclosures. And everything is there all in one place. Additionally, now in our partnership with MasterSpec, those manufacturers who have product master specs, a user can go directly from this page to the product master spec page, get the specs, and alternatively from the product master spec page can come here to get the transparency disclosures. I'm going to pass things over to Wendy now, and I'm going to come back and talk about the growing pains and the challenges moving forward, and roll in the work that Wendy's going to talk about to this larger set of challenges. So
great. Well, thank you again, Michael and Terry, for inviting me to be part of the webinar today. What I want to do is give a brief recap of the Health Product Declaration, the 5 years since we formally established the organization and launched the version 1.0 of the standard. And so I think many of you on the call today are probably familiar with the HPD, so I won't spend a lot of time going into what it is, but suffice it to say, we do have the goal to make it easy to report and use information on material health, and that's our sole focus really as an organization. So as I mentioned a moment ago, in 2012, we launched the HPD Open Standard version 1.0 after a working group had come together to create that first version of the standard. We've been through several revisions now, and we have an ongoing revision process and really focused on learning and improvement. And I think what you see here as of now reflects the fact that we have increasingly been making this a very usable and workable standard, with over 400 manufacturers reporting information, and at this point over 3,600 published HPD reports. And as Terry said, each of those reports represents one or more products. Our goal, and I'll give you some insight into what we're doing with this over the coming months and years, is to really work to grow adoption so that this becomes the way that information about material health in the building industry, and perhaps beyond even the building industry, becomes reported, and that the tools and methodologies and practice protocols necessary to use this information come into place. Really quickly, the standard itself consists of two parts: a format and instructions. The format shows specifically which data elements are to be reported, and the goal here is that if you pick up one report or another report, the format is the same, and you can go exactly to the same place on each one of those to find this information, regardless of what type of product it is or from which manufacturer it might come. Also, the instructions are extremely precise and detailed, instruct the manufacturer on exactly how to report that information. We also have guidance documents that supplement that. So I think another key point that I want to really emphasize here is that the HPD Open Standard is not intended to be yet another method for reporting this information. It's intended to reflect a consensus of key stakeholders in the industry on how we all agree to do this. and be the embodiment of those agreements. And so the whole process of our organization, which is, as Michael mentioned, a not-for-profit member organization, is to provide the forum, the mechanisms, the governance for those results to come into place, with the end result being that we all coalesce around one way of doing this. And so that has the obvious benefits of reducing duplication, reducing a lot of redo. We want to reuse, not redo. We don't want to see a situation where manufacturers are getting many different requests for slightly varying ways of reporting exactly more or less the same thing. And we also want to grow the consensus around which pieces of information really are needed to perform this material health task of decision making about products when we take these health considerations into account. So we're still in the fairly early stages of this. As Terry mentioned with the diffusion of innovation, this is still kind of in the early adopter phase. And so learning is really important. And that's why we are really looking at that feedback, and we really encourage that from our manufacturing community, our user community, to come in and help us so we can advance the standard to better reflect this growing consensus and also experience on how to do these things. There are 3 levels that are pertinent to the standard. The first is just the reporting, as we've talked about. What is the data? How do I report it? Our goal is that the data is accurate, it is reliable, and very importantly, it is consistent across products and product categories. Ultimately, what a designer or architect would like to be able to do, a building owner, is say, how do I optimize the design of this building or this space, considering health? And we want to make that very, very simple. Ultimately, you know, in my mind, I think about a day where it might be able to push a button and that analysis takes place, crunching all this data. The big data analytics types of techniques that we know about today could be applied there. Disclosure and transparency are up to the manufacturer to determine which of these data elements am I willing to, am I permitted to report? That really is about disclosure. At what thresholds? 100 parts per million, 1,000 parts per million, using SDS levels, etc. And then transparency. And we do advocate for the growing transparency of this information. And what that means is a willingness to make it public, which can be a daunting challenge if you've never considered sharing information about the formulation of your products. One of the reasons why this is so important is the open innovation that it makes possible, because underlying some of the challenging chemicals that we're all working with are industry-wide challenges. It's not a challenge for one particular manufacturer necessarily. Many people may use this particular ingredient. And so if we can find alternatives by collaboration and working together, by openly understanding perhaps the magnitude of that problem, or being able to identify shared problems, we can perhaps advance things more rapidly. I come from the technology industry background, and certainly we've seen in that industry, the beginning of my career was very structured in a proprietary knowledge way. I was trained as a young engineer and product marketing person that we protect our information. We don't share it unless absolutely necessary. That's really transformed today. And much of what we benefit from as users of technology in the information space has benefited from the use of open standards and open collaborative innovation, especially bringing users of the technology and makers of the technology together. And so we really aspire to fuel that sort of opportunity within our industry. The manufacturer information comes via the standard into the report. And so it's a very simple, straightforward mechanism to do that. We provide a builder tool that allows manufacturers to do that in a facilitated manner, because it does get complicated. And the other key part of this is that we're working closely with the ecosystem partners. We are not ourselves, as this small nonprofit member organization, focused on the reporting standard and specification. going to be able to or want to develop all the tools, methods, practice protocols, and so on. This is an ecosystem effort, and it's going to take many participants beyond any one organization to be able to develop all of the tools and capabilities necessary to do what we're talking about here. And this is what fuels this diffusion of the technology, is when these things start to happen. And we've had an amazing explosion of these capabilities since we started. This chart here identifies some of the key groups that we're working with in key areas: screening and assessment methods, certifications, libraries and interpretive tools, and there are more coming all the time. And so this is very, very encouraging to us, obviously, that we can see that it really is growing as a trend. The participation is growing, and so consequently businesses, and two of them are right here with us on this call, start to see interesting opportunities for them to start investing. And that's what we're really trying to fuel, is that industry-wide investment to identify the problems, find the problems, solve the problems, add value, and fuel this virtuous cycle of innovation that will make things happen. I want to just touch briefly on our organization, the HPD Collaborative. As I said, it's really intended to provide this forum for the industry to come together to identify problems and solve them through a collaborative process. We have, over the last, in 2015, we opened up our membership from our original founding group of 23 founding companies. And so in a little over 2 years, we have grown the organization now to 220 organizations, represents over 500 individual participants. And this is the single largest organization dedicated to this particular area in actually any industry, as I've come to learn by talking to people in other industry segments. One of the key things we have is a governance structure for the HPD Open Standard that gives you confidence that it's being well maintained, documented, so on. And then we've launched our tools, our repository, as I mentioned, where over 3,600 HPDs already have been published, made public. This is transparency. These are transparent documents. It is the authoritative single source, and then we link it to tools like Sustainable Minds so that that accurate, up-to-date information can be available everywhere. Our builder tool, as I mentioned, and then this growing third-party tool. And so we launched just in the last several months our third-party verification program, which is really key for a standard to have, I'll say, standing. And then our supply chain tools are coming along. This will be something, if you're interested, that we will be talking about a lot more within the HPDC and launching later this year to be used with HPDs. And then automated data exchange is really important. So just in summary, I'd like to just point to a few key steps that we see are necessary to fuel this advancement and grow that adoption, as Terry showed on the curve. Implementing the harmonized data flow with all the ecosystem tools is really key. Improving data quality and completeness so that when you go to find one of these declarations, it's actually there. Working with the ecosystem, as I mentioned. One thing in particular we're going to be working on are some template specifications this year, and then driving this learning and feedback process. These are all going to be really critical steps. We put a lot of the basics in place now. So I want to thank again Terry and Michael for inviting me today, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. So Terry, back over to you.
Well, thank you, Wendy. And I do want to, again, welcome any questions people might have as they're listening. I know it's a lot of data, a lot of information. Any questions that we don't get to or that you don't think of right now, there's an exit survey. You can leave them there. We'll certainly follow up. So getting back now to what do we need to do to move forward, and Wendy has talked about what they're looking at doing, which has a lot to do with number 2, continuing to standardize technical guidelines, results, and delivery. But what I'm showing you is what came out of a working group that was hosted by the AIA at Greenbuild 2017. that convened a group of product manufacturers, solution providers, AECs, and other interested parties to try to get our arms around what are the most urgent challenges facing product transparency in the building industry. And these were the top 4 things that came out. The need for education across the industry, standardization of technical guidelines, results, and delivery, both of environmental reporting and material ingredient reporting, the ease of finding products with credible transparency information. And this was interesting because there was a perception in the AEC group that there weren't enough products with transparency information. And then certainly from the manufacturers is, and for you on the call, how do we demonstrate an ROI for investing in these technical disclosures and ultimately using them in marketing? So here's our take on these 4 challenges and putting kind of a finer point on them. Yes, the need for education across the industry is the number 1 need. Everybody needs more education. Everybody inside the manufacturer's organization, the technical people, the sales people, the marketing people, product management, of what does this product transparency data mean for us in the way we make our products and the way we market our products, and how are we going to tell those stories to enable product selection and specification? And on the AEC side, the same education. What are manufacturers actually doing to improve? What is the data telling them? How to use the information to make selection and ultimately specification decisions. And so, we work very hard at Sustainable Minds to integrate education into every solution and service that we provide, because people don't have any more time than what they already have to get their job done. So people kind of need to learn while they do. The next, in terms of standardization of technical guidelines, there are a lot of standards and a lot of detail in those standards. And because, and I'm going to speak now directly to ISO 14025 and now the new reporting standard out of Europe, ISO 21930. These have been developed by technical committees to be really technically watertight in terms of how LCA gets done and how the information needs to be reported, without a lot of consideration to the user experience of that information, both by manufacturers working to create PCRs and ultimately their own EPDs, as well as the consumers trying to use that information, again, to make comparative decisions. So moving forward on both kinds of transparency reporting, disclosures need to be made more understandable, meaningful, and comparative, ultimately. And the technical standards themselves need to be made simpler, easier to implement. And when all this happens, there will actually be cost reductions in the cost of doing disclosures, doing these technical studies and making the disclosures, because now everything's simpler and standardized. You take LCA providers who struggle with every PCR being different, which means they have to spend a lot of time figuring it out and then do the LCA in accordance to that PCR. And then if they have a particularly aggressive verifier, then there's always iterations, and all those costs go right back to the manufacturer. So all that to say, making things simpler, more standardized, more understandable will ultimately make things more cost effective as well as effective generally. Now, the ease of finding products with credible transparency information, we now know that there really are plenty of products. And in a couple slides and in the report, we are going to talk about the range of marketing platforms that are now available to manufacturers to make their product information available, and what criteria do you want to use to be able to evaluate those solutions. Finally, the fourth one, the ability for manufacturers to demonstrate an ROI. What we've observed is that these technical disclosures originated in the technical departments of product manufacturers. And now what's happening is that those technical disclosures were originally kind of thrown over the wall, but now there's more happening, so it's becoming more of a pass-through. But there's a lot of change and collaboration that's never happened before that needs to happen to get those technical disclosures into the hands of sales and marketing, and to be able to operationalize the whole process, the creation of those disclosures, and then the training and the distribution of that product information and those disclosures. And so because of all of this change that's happening and these initial kind of startup costs, a lot of manufacturers aren't really sure yet how they will measure the ROI of product transparency, short of being told specifically that they won projects because they had products with disclosures. And in yesterday's webinar, we asked that in the exit interview, we asked the AECs, how many of you have actually specified products because they had transparency disclosures if everything else was equal? And then did you tell the manufacturer that you did that? Half of them said yes, half of them said no, we didn't tell the manufacturer. So I think there's some feedback mechanisms that are going to be important to get in place to make sure that at least that is happening. But today in 2018, the biggest challenge is, and this is what we asked you in the registration, I'm going to ask again on the way out, is it easy to find your products with transparency information on your own website or anywhere else? How much time are you spending educating reps and or responding to requests from AECs about disclosures and what they mean? And finally, are you able to help your customers get these products into the spec and ultimately into the building? So, what does success look like? No more green building, just building. Success looks like product transparency is integrated into product marketing, their performance criteria, just like the other criteria people use to make decisions: functional performance, cost, aesthetics, safety. And now we have these two additional criteria that should just all be in one place. And when this happens, we will be creating preference for those brands and those products through education, which is going to drive behavior change, and everybody benefits. So our outlook for 2018 and beyond is that we are in a great place to execute on the opportunity that we're all in this for, which is to reduce the impacts from the built environment on the natural environment. And those manufacturers who will be able to tell their greener and healthier product stories will win the day, we believe. Just to give you a sense of what's in the rest of the trend report, and we'll be covering in the subsequent months webinar, is more detail on PCR creation, correlation to EPDs and the manufacturers who've been involved. We do maintain the transparency catalog for North America, the PCR catalog for North America. So it's pretty interesting to see where PCRs have been created and where they have not, and why certain manufacturers are a little reluctant to get involved. We're going to look at some creation of EPDs over time. And we dig into the material ingredient reporting. You can see, and this is why we had Wendy on, it has been, I'm going to use the word popular in air quotes, or the most utilized disclosure program for material ingredient reporting. All of the programs, all of the processes for all of these programs are the same, but each one is a little bit different, and the final deliverable is a little bit different. And so manufacturers are challenged with, how do we select the programs or the program that fits our needs to be able to tell the story about our products? And we have the same conversation with the AECs. How are you choosing which types of disclosures you're asking manufacturers to provide? What do you do with the information? And by the way, do you tell them not only you're asking for the disclosure, do you tell them how you use the information to make decisions? And we asked that in yesterday's exit survey as well. And actually, none of them said, did they tell manufacturers how they use the information to make decisions? We're going to break it down into what can be learned from each type of disclosure, which is really how ultimately people should consider choosing. What do each of them, what story do they tell? And then finally, just to give you a little bit of background on how has Sustainable Minds pulled together this data and been able to have this purview. So back in 2013, we actually had the insight that product transparency needed to be integrated into product marketing. And so over the years, we've worked on each of those big challenges, how to make things understandable and meaningful, how to standardize standards. We became a program operator and wrote the first 2-part PCR program for North America, and have created our series of transparency products that literally integrate the disclosure data into marketing tools online. These are what you find in the featured brands in the catalog. And our view of success for the transparency catalog in the future is that every manufacturer will have a brand showroom with transparency reports, performance fact sheets, material health overviews that let you integrate your marketing stories, the functional performance information, and the environmental information all in one place. And last year at Greenbuild, we introduced our new project builder and configurator that allows project teams to select products, configure them for projects, save them, request quotes, request specification help, and in a real way gets qualified leads into a pipeline for manufacturers and delivers leads that are well into the selection and purchasing process. And then finally, we've done the same thing for how do you select a solution or solutions to market your products. There's a whole range of criteria, just like we created for the material selection. Bottom line is, how do people choose the tools that they use? And it's ultimately based on what they believe about the brand and the user experience. So that brings us to the final consideration of value proposition and ROI. How can you as manufacturers put together the business case to support the investment so that you really do have some metrics and goals to achieve that aren't kind of fuzzy and waiting for people to give you feedback? This is something we work on with every manufacturer that we work with. And that brings us to the top of our time. We have some questions, but want to thank all of you who have stayed through the hour for making time. We hope you'll come again. And Michael, why don't you see if there's some of those questions.
Yeah, we'll run through a couple questions pretty quickly. First one here is, our biggest headache is curating data on so many different databases, even those that have APIs that connect to the certification bodies. I see a problem of outdated information living on these transparency sites and a huge cost to manufacturers to maintain it. What is to be done to address these concerns?
I think what we're going to do is probably have another webinar on exactly that topic. This is part of the growing pains in this diffusion of innovation and how you ultimately, as a manufacturer, make decisions about where and how you're going to market your products. Sustainable Minds is not an advocate of a manufacturer marketing their products in only one location. Is like any other industry, like the travel industry, for example, you're going to want your products to be found in more than one place. But ultimately, you want people to come back to your own website, which is where you've invested the money to do business with folks. So a lot of the issues that just got listed in that question are endemic to some of the solutions that are available in the market today, but not all of them. So we will have content about this in the trend report, and I think it's an important enough subject to meet it head on in a way that that answers some of these key questions.
Great. Next question, is anyone doing anything to combine all of the emerging sustainability standards into something businesses can manage? The sheer number in furniture, LEED, LBC, WELL, HHI, MM, not to mention the international ones, is no longer manageable as each competes for space and none seems uniquely placed to show whether or not the product is good or not. In other words, complying with all these standards is getting really expensive and eats away at product margin, making them harder to sell to management or get behind.
No, that's a great question and builds on the previous one. Part of the reason why we're publishing the trend report next week after these webinars is to see what kinds of questions emerged, both to set the research agenda for 2018 and to provide some answers to the best of the ability that we have with the current state of the market. I'm
Okay.
sorry, I don't have a better answer right now.
Yeah, I would just add on that particular one, I think it does reflect a lack of consensus because they are different. And I think as there's more experience with that, one of the things we really have to look at is these higher level determinations. What are the criteria? Is it going to be a red list based? I mean, there's all kinds of different approaches that are being experimented with, and these standards certifications and rating systems reflect that. So I think it is going to, it's possible we'll see more actually before we start to see some consolidation. But this, as Terry says, is very typical of what happens during this sort of explosive growth period where people have different takes on things. And
just from
it's not uncommon.
And from the master spec point of view, we have actually found that to be a fairly significant challenge as well. Maintaining and updating both language for sustainability and then connecting to products that have sustainable or sustainability related documentation, whether it's anything we've discussed in this call or other declarations or documentation, is actually, it's a huge challenge. And we've talked to a lot of architects and engineers, and they don't necessarily all have a solution in place that works for them. You know, some you still use a spreadsheet, some use a file folder, some use a cloud service, and then they've got all sorts of different opinions as to which works best and then where they like to go. So it's definitely an issue that we've run into multiple times, and I think it's worth some further discussion. Another question here. It appears that material declarations are growing in use while Type 3 environmental declarations are slowing. Is that a direct reflection on cost and the ability for manufacturers to demonstrate ROI?
That's a great question. I don't know that I would say that the environmental performance reporting is slowing. It just takes longer to do them. The process from the beginning of starting with creating a PCR, which is why in the next webinar, we're going to really drill into the importance of creating good PCRs, because it will not only reduce the cost, it will reduce the time it takes to produce an LCA and a Type 3 environmental declaration. It's only through producing the Type 3 environmental declarations that we can get access to a carbon footprint. And if the carbon economy is the top issue that we're looking at, and earlier this year we did a webinar with the folks from the 2030 Challenge, Product Challenge. That challenge is about carbon reduction. And so if manufacturers aren't able to measure their carbon footprint, we're not going to be able to get our arms around carbon reduction. So I would say that the relative disparity between the number of disclosures, one, is potentially not reflective of the number of products covered, because we don't know. Many EPDs, again, cover hundreds of products. But I think it is probably easier to get started with a material disclosure because there's less to do. There is no new standard to create. It's not a lifecycle based approach, so there's potentially less data to collect. But it's a great way to get started and does put people on the path of then being able to move into environmental performance. And I think that people who have come to this webinar really want to assure them that, people like Sustainable Minds and the people that we partner with are absolutely committed to simplification and standardization because it's the right thing to do. And we know, it's really difficult for you, manufacturers, to be doing this even though you want to. So, we're all part of this virtuous cycle contributing to the built environment. And we all have a role to play to make it easier, simpler, more cost-effective, and ultimately to drive revenue and growth through greener product innovation. So we feel your pain and we appreciate your questions, and we are putting those as top priority issues to be working on this year and the years to come.
Great. With that, we've got to wrap up. Thank you all for your time. And like Terry mentioned, we have a webinar series at the end of every month, typically on the 27th and 28th or around those dates. So look for a different topic next month. Thanks all.
Thank you very much.
Wendy and Terry.
Bye.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Terry.